Well, the last 4 episodes were fun, but they were exhausting. As you know, I'm a huge Beatle fan, and reliving their breakup and then trying to rank the post-Beatle albums was a labor of love, but it was laborious. So to paraphrase Mr. McCartney, I'm tired of carrying that weight. So I thought in this episode we'd lighten the load a little bit. So what we're going to do is look at what is now antiquated technology and how it all came together to create something new and totally unique in 1970 and 71. And I get to revel in the fact that I was right in the middle of its rock and roll heart when it happened. Let's drop the needle. I've told you in previous episodes that in the late 60s and early 70s I was a disc jockey in Los Angeles, most notably at KPBC, which was the premier underground radio station in the West Coast, or probably even the country. We were always looking at ways to stretch the airwaves and do something different. And in 1970 and 71, we did it twice, and it was epic. In 1970, the way we consumed music and videos was way different than it is today. For most of the 60s, music was heard over AM radio, in scratchy sound and in mono. By the way, AM stands for amplitude modulation, which is how the frequencies are actually broadcast. As a side note, the very first US AM radio network was created by American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Yep, AT&T. So when you heard something on the radio that you really liked, and say you wanted to own it, well, you had to go purchase one of these, which was called a 45 or a single, because that was the speed, the RPM, that it operated on a record player. This is actually my first record player. I got it when I was about 3. There was another type of record which is called long play albums, and they rotated at 33 1/3 RPM, much slower and required a more fancy turntable. Most of these long play albums, or LPs, were actually soundtracks or even Mantovani recordings. Go ahead and Google that one. But that all changed in 1963 with the British invasion. All of a sudden, instead of buying singles, you could buy an album which had most of the singles on it. Also, something new was happening in radio, something called FM radio, which stands for frequency modulation. It allowed for the signal to have less static and more clarity, and more importantly, it allowed for the signal to be broadcast in stereo. As album sales started to boom and FM radio was taking off, a concept called underground radio came to the forefront, which would focus on playing music from the albums, not the top 40 hits that you were hearing on AM radio. KPBC, the radio station that I worked at, started as a result of the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. B. Mitchell Reed was a DJ in LA, and he met Tom Donahue, a DJ in San Francisco. And together they created an underground format which would focus on these new albums. And they created a new station in Pasadena, California. Yep, that was KPBC. And a new era was born, and history was about to be made. So now, besides owning albums, you could also listen to them on FM radio and in stereo as well. Now as to video. Well, for most of the 60s, broadcast television was 3 channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they broadcast in black and white, and of course, in mono. Color TV really only took off when Walt Disney and a cowboy show called Bonanza started broadcasting in color. But color sets were expensive, and so public acceptance was slow. In rural areas where the broadcast signal was weak, something came along called cable TV, which sent the signal down a cable into your home. Now actually, when I was in college, I wrote a paper saying cable television would never catch on outside of rural areas, because why would people in a metropolitan area pay for signals that they were getting free from broadcast? Whew, boy, was I wrong. So cable exploded, and programming choices exploded. And now you could watch programs in color. But whenever a musician appeared on television, the sound was still going to be mono. Okay, so let's return to KPBC. B. Mitchell Reed had started something, and our program director at the time was Les Carter, and he was always looking for something new. He wanted to stretch the envelope. He wanted people to listen to KPBC because we were doing innovative things. Now, it turns out that Les was friends with the management companies of both Leon Russell and Cat Stevens. So Les and our chief engineer went down into LA to KCET, which was a very small public television station that also was looking at ways to expand their audience. So together they came up with this innovative idea that KCET would host concerts in their studios and broadcast them to their audience. But of course, it would be in mono. So the innovative idea was the signal would also be sent to KPBC. And at KPBC, we could broadcast the audio in stereo to our audience. So this is the way it would work. At home, you'd set your TV to KCET and turn the sound down. Then you'd go over to your amplifier like this one here, and you'd set it to your radio tuner to KPPC FM, and now you would get stereo coming into your living room through your big speakers. So you could see the musician on television, but also hear him in stereo on your radio at the same time. These simulcasts were totally unique. And I remember it was a big deal at KPBC. We did lots of testing because we wanted to make sure that when the program actually aired, our stereo signal was in sync and was great. So we wanted to make sure it rocked. And boy, did it ever. Both stations heavily promoted the technology and the concerts. And Leon Russell was first. In 1970, he created a program called Leon Russell and Friends, which was the first stereo rock and roll broadcast. Leon had an hour-long concert. He had lots of his musician friends there. He was in total control. There were kids all over the studio. They even had an assistant who baked a pie during the session. It was a show like none other that you had ever seen or in fact heard. Unfortunately, it's never been released as an album. Hopefully his estate may do that someday soon. However, I did find a link on the internet, and here it is, where you can actually see Leon Russell and his friends. Cat Stevens followed with a similar concert in June of '71, playing hits from his albums Monobone Jacone and Tea for the Tillerman. Again, same deal. Cat on TV and his music on our radio. So we created two totally unique and very creative concert performances. But there was a problem. Only people in Los Angeles could see them. There was no way to record them at your home. The first home recording format, Betamax, came out in 1973. And the inferior but more popular VHS came out in 1975, years after both of these concerts had aired. So since you couldn't record the video in your home, people were much more interested in recording the music. And they did that a lot. And it was pretty easy to do if you had the right equipment. You would route the radio signal through your amplifier and feed it to your reel-to-reel recorder, and that would allow you to record the stereo soundtrack. And in the case with Leon Russell and Cat Stevens simulcasts, when you did record them on reel-to-reel, you got an extremely rare album, which has never been released by the artists. In fact, here is my reel-to-reel tape, and I'll zoom in here and you can take a look at where it actually says KPPC Leon Russell recording. Now, unfortunately, my recording of Cat Stevens has vanished over the tracks of time, but not to worry. Cat Stevens is releasing Live at KCET as part of the 50th anniversary release of the album Tea for the Tillerman. Here are the songs from our simulcast, which will be on that release. The simulcasts are big hits in Los Angeles, and they weren't actually one-offs, because we did repeat them a few times to large audiences. But then, they just vanished into the airwaves. It was a very exciting time where a number of technologies, broadcast television, FM stereo radio, reel-to-reel tape recorders, all came together to make history. And yeah, you had to be there. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out. Most of the albums that I talk about can be found at your local vinyl store or on eBay. Individual songs most likely are on Spotify, Apple Music, or Amazon Music, or even some on YouTube.